All right, well, I have 4:15, so I think we'll go ahead and get started with this last session of the PFI conference. Thanks so much, everyone, for sticking with us this far. We hope you had a great time. My name is Jorgen Rose. I'm the Habitat Program Manager for Practical Farmers of Iowa. I will be facilitating this session today for our featured speaker, Sarah Nizzi, who, as you can see, is joining us via Zoom. So the session today is pollinator conservation for the homestead and backyard garden. Before I let Sarah get to the good stuff, I just have a few housekeeping notes. So this session, like all the others, will be 60 minutes. It will run until 5:15, and as I mentioned, it is our last session. So for the evaluations, hopefully that you have been filling out those evaluations as you've been going along. Please remember to turn those in at the first floor registration desk. We really appreciate your feedback. Just our standard note on civility, please be mindful that we are a diverse group representing many perspectives. Please be generous with your questions, respectful with your comments, and uphold PFI's core value of providing a welcoming space for everyone to talk about farming and agriculture. And I think with that, I can turn things over to Sarah Nizzi. She is a Farm Bill pollinator conservation planner and Natural Resources Conservation Service partner biologist, which is quite the title. I think she'll tell us what that means here shortly. Sarah works for the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation and is going to tell us all about the excellent opportunities that backyards and acreages offer for providing critical habitat for pollinators and other invertebrates. So with that, Sarah, thank you so much. You can take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jorgen, and thank you to PFI for allowing me to speak today and inviting me to talk on this subject, and for being flexible in these continuously strange times. I wish that I could be there in person, but I'm just thankful that I'm able to still present to you in some capacity. So as Jorgen alluded to, I have a very long title, and I'm a partner biologist with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And basically, I provide technical and financial outreach to anyone interested in pollinator habitat or really any native diverse habitat across the state. I am based in central Iowa, but I can travel all over, and occasionally we'll travel to just outside, surrounding the state. And I also train NRCS staff and partner staff on all things related to pollinators, as well as native plant vegetation management, native seed mixes, native plant ID, etc. So I wear a lot of hats most of the time. But today we're going to take a step back from those larger, expansive, multiple acreage habitat projects and think a little closer to home. So we always like to start off our presentations talking about the Xerxes Society and what we do. So I'll do a brief introduction of that. We're an international nonprofit organization based in Portland, Oregon, that works to preserve wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates. We just celebrated 50 years in December, which was really exciting. We started off as a butterfly conservation organization and evolved over the decades to encompass all invertebrate species, including freshwater mussels, fireflies, bumblebees, butterflies, beneficial insects, etc. We have a number of different what we call teams. So I am part of the pollinator team. We also have an endangered species team that gives voice to the imperiled, often underrepresented species. They conduct policy work at the local, state, and federal levels for those species. They do research, they provide education and outreach. They really do amazing work. Our pesticide team is small and mighty and keeps us informed on all things pesticide related and keeps us up to date on all the latest research. We also have a few individuals that are working with our Bee City affiliates and our Bee Campus affiliates, our Xerxes Ambassador volunteer program, where people all over the country are volunteering for Xerxes to spread our message and implement invertebrate conservation within their communities. And providing education and outreach, like all the webinars that we've been posting pretty regularly throughout the pandemic. But here, this map is focused on our pollinator team. So the red stars indicate those of us that are NRCS partner biologists, and we may work at just a state level, such as myself, or cover 2 states. And we also have people that are covering a regional space within the country. So we really help NRCS at the ground level all the way up to influencing national policy. And then the blue stars are our staff that are working within the private sector. So they're working with large companies like Cheerios, large growers, municipalities, DOTs, et cetera, to implement pollinator conservation within those spaces. So today, we have a lot of things to talk about. I could spend an entire day talking about many of the things that I am supposed to cover in 40 minutes. So I'll start off by saying we're really just kind of scratching the surface here. We could dig a lot deeper very easily. But I'll go over kind of pollinators and how they're doing, the components of pollinator habitat, as well as the biology and ecology of pollinators. I think it's really important to understand the life cycle and just really have a full understanding of these species in order to grasp those habitat components and really determine why they're important. We will discuss layout and design, plant materials, management, etc. So to be sure that we're all on the same page, we're going to meet the pollinators. These are examples of what we consider our invertebrate pollinators. So things like bees, wasps, butterflies, moths, beetles, and flies. Our vertebrate pollinators consist of birds and bats. In Iowa, we have the ruby-throated hummingbird. We don't have any bats within our region that are providing those pollinator services, but they do elsewhere in parts of the country and other parts of the world. In Iowa, the DNR has documented roughly 400 native bee species, 110 reproducing butterflies. So that includes butterflies that overwinter here, as well as migratory butterflies, and over 2,000 moth species. But bees are our most efficient pollinator. They are actively collecting and transporting pollen. They are doing this purposely. It is their mission. It's their goal in life. It's what makes their world go round. They consume pollen throughout every life stage, which our other pollinators don't do. Flies, for example, are predaceous as larvae and only consume pollen and or nectar as adults. Wasps can be in the same boat. So bees are what we consider direct pollinators because they're going out with that purpose. And the other insect pollinators are really doing it by accident. They are feeding and going about their business, and pollination is just sort of happening amongst all of that. Bees are efficient in that they can exhibit flower constancy, which means they can visit many of the same species. So they can go from a sunflower to a sunflower to a sunflower. They also can know if another insect has already visited that flower. They detect that, they see it, they move on. So they're not going to waste time where it's not needed. And they prefer to forage in and around the nest area. Bees are very, very diverse. In the US, we have roughly 3,600 native bee species. In North America, that's upwards of 4,000. And they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And that really influences the distance in which they can travel. So it makes a lot more sense to stay as close to home as possible, but that also benefits the plants. And unfortunately, it's no surprise for many of us that insects and biodiversity in general has been facing decline. There are many charismatic species, larger fauna within the world that have gotten a lot of attention, like polar bears. But the monarch butterfly and colony collapse disorder is what really sparked the public's interest in kind of realizing, oh, there's something going on and maybe we should be concerned about it. And there are things going on. There's lots of threats to pollinators and biodiversity in general. Habitat loss really being number one, and followed in no particular order is, pesticides, disease, climate change, invasive species, And something we often don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but lights. And since this is geared towards acreages and within yards and cities and towns, I think it's important to briefly talk about lights. Moths and fireflies are really picking up those pollination services when everything else is dormant for the night and when we are asleep, and they're doing that work unnoticed. But lights do cause problems, and moths are providing pollination services. Fireflies are doing the same, but they're also beneficial insects. So some things that we can do to mitigate that is eliminating lights where they're perhaps maybe not really needed, or changing the color of the lights. And I want to briefly discuss some of the at-risk species that we have in Iowa and that are also considered at risk in other parts of the Midwest, and whose ranges expand beyond the Midwest. So we have 3 federally listed species. The Poweshiek skipperling is considered federally endangered, as well as the rusty-patched bumblebee, and the Dakota skipper is considered federally threatened. So the Dakota skipper and the Poweshiek skipperling are considered extirpated from the state. So we do not have recent numbers of these species. They were once home to parts of northern Iowa, north central, northwest, but they are gone. They're not here anymore. The Poweshiek skipperling in particular is removed from a lot of its native home range. The Dakota skipper, I believe, is somewhat hanging on in southern Minnesota. But again, Iowa was home to these 2 species, but we can no longer support them. Thankfully, there's a different story in terms of rusty-patched bumblebee, which occupies about a third, eastern third to half of the state. Iowa seems to be a decent spot, but there are other places within its historic range, moving out east, where that species has not been recorded for a number of years. And each state also has a state listing of at-risk species. And in Iowa, we only have that list for butterflies, but there are just over 30 that are considered at risk to some degree. And thinking larger in North America, 18% of our butterfly species are at risk and declining, and that includes our rare specialist species as well as our once very common generalist species like the monarch butterfly. Bumblebees are in decline. In Iowa, we have 14 documented species, and 5 of those are considered at risk to some degree and potentially in decline. Again, the rusty-patched bumblebee, and then other groups have now petitioned for the American bumblebee. And this is especially alarming because bumblebees are very critical to our crops as well as our wildflowers. They are basically the top dog, top tier, rock star pollinators. No one really does it better than bumblebees do. They are 100% built to be the best. They are large, they're very hairy. They're able to forage in low light earlier in the day, later in the day, in cooler temperatures, when conditions aren't favorable for other species. They can perform buzz pollination, which about 8% of flowering plants require in order to pollinate. We know a lot about bumblebees because thankfully there isn't 3,600 of them or, a large number of them like our other native bee species. They take up relatively larger, somewhat ranges, so they're easier to find, they're bigger, we can identify them to the species level, so we do know a lot about them compared to our other native bee species in general. And with all of this decline and these kind of negative numbers and kind of getting down in the dumps about some of this, thankfully, it's pretty easy, relatively speaking, to reverse these declines. Insects and invertebrates can be very resilient, and they can bounce back if they are provided habitat. And habitat can really exist in a number of different places, big or small. Every effort counts. And whether that is just a few plants on a balcony of an apartment that's at least checking one habitat component box, which is better than not checking any of the boxes at all. And when we think about habitat, it's really important to think about landscape context. If any of you guys were in the climate smart habitat session, Tom and I talked about habitat connectivity a lot. And essentially that is what thinking about landscape context is. It's thinking about your place in the world and how your spot can influence other areas and how you can facilitate movement within your landscape. So that can be done, out in the wild or in the rural areas, but also within cities and towns. So thinking about the many different places that could be offering food, could be offering nesting or overwintering habitats, and just ensuring that pollinators and other insects are able to move around and to take advantage of these spaces if they can, to ensure that we have healthy populations. So getting into the components of habitat, first and foremost, we're going to talk about food. And I think in terms of habitat, most people are very familiar with the fact that we need to have flowers spring through fall. A lot of people know that, but I don't know if it's always known as to why that is. And essentially it is because we have a diverse number of species, particularly bees. At Xerxes, we focus a lot on bees because, again, they are really the best pollinators, directly pollinating on purpose. And they're emerging at different times throughout the year. There are certain species that are only present in the early spring, and then you do not see them for 11 months. There are other species that are emerging in the summer or emerging in late summer, coming into the fall. Bumblebee species can be active for 6 months out of the year. So it's just important to ensure that we have food available throughout the entire growing season. Early foraging and early spring can be a challenge in terms of providing food, but trees and shrubs offer forage much earlier than our native prairie plants. So that is key, and especially within cities and towns and yards, it's pretty easy to implement trees and shrubs. Many of them we have many native options that offer food, but they can also provide nesting habitat as well as host plants. And host plants are more than just milkweeds. We often spend a lot of time thinking about milkweeds and monarchs, but we have a plethora of wild native plants that are also host plants, and that includes prairie species, woodland species, savanna species, of flowers, as well as grasses that are beneficial to a number of skipper butterflies, trees that are host plants for hundreds of moths and butterflies, and shrubs as well. These are all what we call different functional groups. So if we can incorporate all of these things into habitat, that's a win. Nesting habitat is also important. And when it comes to bees, we think about it in two different ways: ground nesting bees and cavity nesting bees. But before I get into nesting, I want to go over the solitary bee life cycle. So 80 to 90% of our native bees are what we consider solitary. And solitary means that there is a single female who is creating that nest site and laying those eggs, defending, providing food, basically doing all the work, like a single mom, so to speak, or a single dad, but in this case, female. They live just for a couple weeks out of the year, so about a month. The adults are only out and about to feed and mate. And again, there are no other individuals helping in terms of reproduction or provisioning, collecting food, etc. 70 to 80% of our solitary bees are what we consider ground nesting. So they're going to be occupying spaces of bare or sparsely bare soil. They could be really just at the top of the surface, or potentially a couple inches to several inches or feet under the ground. And they can be ground dwellers kind of by themselves in a place, or they can congregate with many individual nests in one small area. You could have several square feet of maybe 50 to 100 nests of Carlin's mining bee, for example, in the early spring. The other remaining 20 to 30% of solitary bees are what we consider cavity nesters or tunnel nesting bees. And I will say to ignore the two pictures on the bottom left, just pretend those are not here right now because those are not good examples for this slide. But I really just enjoyed all the other pictures that this graphic offered. So they are going to be occupying pithy hollow stems, dead logs, untreated fence posts, dead trees, really any idle woody vegetation that they can burrow into, areas that perhaps another insect had already burrowed into at one point in time. Examples of pithy stems include Baptisia or like white wild indigo, for example, New England aster, Joe pieweed, pale purple coneflower. All of those have naturally existing hollow stems. We get a lot of questions about when people should be trimming back vegetation in terms of just like routine yard work. And many people are doing that ahead of winter. But we really want folks to have some patience and hold on and wait until the spring to cut back any vegetation. So Aline Evans and Sarah Fultz-Jordan put together this nice little brochure publication sometime during the pandemic, I'm not sure when, but that I like to include just because I think it kind of explains the steps really well. But essentially we want to wait till the spring before we cut anything. And you can cut things at 1/2 foot to 2 feet. You know, that height can really vary. That, you know, you don't have to be a stickler about that. That new growth will come up and they'll flower. So you'll have that forage and nesting very well, you know, close by. Those single females, anytime they're out foraging for pollen for the young that they're going to reproduce, they are leaving that nest vulnerable. So they want to have food nearby just to ensure that no predators are getting in and she's not sacrificing her colony. They only produce 25 to 50 offspring, so it's relatively small. Fall and winter comes, you just leave everything the same. The next year, you can cut back that dead vegetation again, and the whole process starts all over. And lastly, we have our social bees, which are bumblebees. There are some sweat bees that are also social, and honeybees are what we would also consider as social bees because there is a division of labor. There are multiple individuals doing their part to ensure the health of the colony. So a queen starts the colony, she finds a nest site, she produces workers, the workers then go out and they forage, they raise the young, they defend the nest. Later in the season, males and new queens are produced. The old queen dies. Males and new queens will emerge. They will hopefully mate with someone from a different nest. Males will die once they've mated, and new mated queens will then collect reserves and prepare to overwinter to start that annual colony all over again. Bumblebee nests can consist of a number of different things, from rock piles to tall bunch grasses, but the common denominator amongst all of these is insulated cavities. They seem to really prefer areas that were occupied by rodents, for example, so abandoned rodent nests, and they can nest at the ground surface or below the ground. And overwintering habitat, which I simply like to think of as just keeping your yard messy before the winter. If you do minimal yard maintenance, you'll be good. Like, you can check that box, it's fine. Leaving leaves, leaving piles of brush, having some rock piles, just having some neglected areas that you just let kind of go wild with Mother Nature, that'll work. We love our Leave the Leaves campaign. We have new signs that are really stellar, I think. If you go to the website, you can check that out. But overwintering is essential to basically these organisms being able to complete their life cycle. And they also provide natural fertilizer, and it provides shelter for more than just pollinators and insects, but other invertebrates as well. And you don't necessarily have to leave every single leaf in your yard, but if you could leave certain areas of your yard a little messy, that's going to be playing a good difference. Okay, so now we're going to get into the considerations and kind of go the step-by-step of how we can implement pollinator habitat in our yards. So first of all, native plant selection. There are a lot of factors when it comes to native plant selection. What soils do you have? Are they dry? Are they medium dry? Medium? Are there areas that get wet and hold water sometimes? How much sunlight do you have available? What species are native to your area? Again, Tom Rosberg and I, if you happen to catch that, spoke a lot about native range for species. How big is the area? That'll influence also the plant materials you might use. What is your budget? That's going to be pretty critical. And one thing that I realized today that I didn't have on here is like, where do you place the habitat? And I'll kind of talk about it a little bit. But these things, will also determine your plant selection as well as potentially your site selection. If there is a spot that's too wet that you can't mow sometimes or what have you, maybe it's better off being a native perennial pollinator habitat or kind of even like a rain garden versus just that wet, ugly spot. And thankfully, we have lots of native plants to choose from, and they have a wide tolerance of soils and sunlight exposure. There are many plants that really straddle both sides, where they can tolerate full sun or partial sun. They can tolerate some dryness, some wetness. This is by no means a comprehensive list of species. It's just a few examples of species and genera that you can choose from. I put asterisks by some of them that I have seen in my experience that get weedy under these conditions, where you end up having a lot of them. Goldenrod has a star next to it. It shouldn't. I forgot to fix that. That should be next to the Rudbeckia or like black-eyed Susans. Anything in the mint family. It's great to have plants, but they do sometimes get out of control occasionally, and you have to weed them out just like everything else. And we also have those native plants that are able to tolerate partial sun to full shade. And many of those are what we would consider savanna species, woodland edge species, or just straight up woodland forest species. But they are excellent pollinator plants. Some of them are host plants. And there's many to choose from that bloom spring, summer, and fall. And some that exist in, the prairie ecosystem as well as woodland edge ecosystem. And grasses are the same way. They can occupy a variety of soils. Some of them have wide tolerances. Some of them don't do really well in full sun as well as partial sun. So occasionally you will see overlap with that. But again, these are just some examples. I also want to mention that it is okay to be planting some non-native species. I know that there are certain non-native species that I just really like. I like snapdragons. Sure, if that's your jam, plant those. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Especially in these scenarios where it's our yards, it could be city plantings, et cetera. We're not doing full-blown prairie reconstructions. So we can play around with that a little bit. We can have a mixture of non-native annuals as well as perennials. Or if it feels like all of this is a little too much of a bite to chew off, you can start by just doing some annual plantings. They're not going to provide the best pollen and nectar resources, likely aren't going to be host plants, but they will still look nice. They will still provide some forage, etc. So I just didn't want to leave that out, or to say that everything has to be 100% native and super pristine and just super high tier all the time. It's certainly okay to mix some of these things. And herbs. If you like to grow fruits and vegetables and have herbs, those are also really important pollinator plants. Pictured here is a dill plant on the left, and that's a host plant for black swallowtails. They like really anything in the carrot family. Their picture on the right is sage that a bumblebee is foraging on, which I see a lot. Other species include borage, thyme, oregano. There's several. And again, your fruits and vegetables that you're growing are likely, producing, some of them are producing flowers that support pollinators and beneficial insects. I believe Jorgen has a handout available to you all of this habitat comparison kind of fact sheet, and it's two-sided. I'm going to go over both sides in this presentation, but we start off with perennial versus annual flowers, and it's really just kind of a walkthrough to see the breakdown, the pros and cons, when it might make sense, when it might not, comparing the cost analysis, the maintenance that goes along with it, plant materials, etc. All right, moving on to site prep. I'm going to talk about organic site prep as well as conventional site prep. And the beauty of some of these smaller places is that organic site prep tends to be easier. And the materials, in order to get it done, are cheap and sometimes readily available, like cardboard. In this example, there are just layers of cardboard stacked on a site. And I would say when doing organic site prep, you want to stretch out that period of time as long as possible. So having that material down for an entire growing season to be sure that you're adequately tilling the weeds and really prepping the soil to have the least amount of weed pressure as possible. I know that it gets really exciting and people just are pumped up to plant and to do fun things. But I know from personal experience that if you don't take your time with organic site prep, you spend forever and hours and days and weeks weeding. So it pays off if you can have some patience. And the other beauty about this example is that they're using dead logs to kind of anchor down that cardboard. You want to be sure that you're not allowing too much airflow or potentially any sunlight and creating a microclimate where weeds can still continue to thrive. So they are serving that purpose, but they're also providing nesting and potentially overwintering habitat as well. So that's a double whammy. Another example of an organic site prep method is smother cropping, where essentially you're using a smother or like a cover crop to smother the weeds. So this is an example of buckwheat. It will create a dense canopy. It will shade out other weeds. It'll flower and provide great floral resources for pollinators as well as beneficial insects. It can be a little finicky in terms of sunlight. It prefers full sun. It does well with having some rain, some moisture. If there's drought conditions like we've been having, not always optimal, but I will say as soon as it rains, it really does pop up. But if you have medium soils, it can be a really, really great tool. And it worked well in this example. It's an annual, it will reseed itself. But folks have reported that even plants that have come back the next year, they're really not too much of an issue and they're not really worried about it. We have a really comprehensive publication that goes over organic site prep methods for wildflower establishment. It deep dives into each one of these. It has case studies involved. So if you want to learn more about organic site prep, I highly recommend checking out this publication. We also have the conventional site prep option of using herbicides. Sometimes the weed pressure is just too high, and it makes more sense to just go ahead and use herbicide to kill that off. Or if you're participating in any sort of cost share program, sometimes the timeline is not very friendly to organic site prep. So that influences people to go conventionally. But I will get into this specific scenario a little bit later. Plant materials, plugs versus seed. When we are doing these sorts of projects, smaller scale, we have the luxury of really being able to decide if we use plugs versus seed. When we do large projects of, 2 acres more, seed really makes most sense, just because it's such a large area and it's not so labor intensive. But when we're thinking about yards or cities and
Thanks, Catherine.
parks, etc., plugs can make sense if you have the budget for it. Plugs can be a phenomenal alternative.
I just thought I'd let you know. Once again,
you can have control over what types of plugs you can, hand choose. You'll know exactly what diversity you have. You see it instantaneously when you put it in the ground. It could flower the first year. You can strategically place species in certain areas. So you have a lot of control over that scenario versus seed, where you throw it out there and you know what you planted, but you don't necessarily know what it's going to look like in the end. So on the flip side of that fact sheet is a comparison of seed versus transplants. And again, the pros and cons, the different considerations. Starting from seed is cheaper, but there's a lot of maintenance that goes along with it. Starting from plugs is expensive, but you get results fast. So, that's basically up to the size of the project, your budget, etc. Layout and design. First and foremost, if we can avoid pesticide exposure, that is awesome. Especially for those folks that may be living on acreages or living outside of town and are exposed to agricultural landscapes. If you're worried about spray drift or what have you, strategically placing your pollinator habitat to avoid that is great. Or even when you're in the city, if you're next to a public space that gets treated, the grass gets treated, or a business, etc. If you can purposely put a planting somewhere where it's not going to have that exposure, or try to mitigate that, we prefer that. Thinking about the height of these species is really important, and this really is geared towards plugs, because when it comes to seed, the size of the area, the outline of the area, but you're going to put seed out there, and what grows, and it's up to Mother Nature after that. So plugs, again, you have that control. You can be more strategic about your design. So you want to keep in mind the height of species. You want to make sure that you're intermixing grass to help with that structure and kind of keep species from flopping over one another. You don't want to shade out smaller species. Lots of people say that if you clump 3 species alike and kind of move them around, that's great. Again, intermixing those grasses, having grasses that are cool season and warm season is critical. Cool seasons are actively growing in the spring, early summer. They go dormant throughout the peak of the summer, and then green up again later in the fall when temperatures cool down. And those warm seasons are actively growing throughout the summer. And we have a number of native grass that are either cool season or warm season. But it's important to have both. They're providing that nesting and overwintering habitat, they're host plants, and it's just ensuring that you're having that active growth and things are looking nice all throughout the year. Management. That can really depend on the type and scale of your project. And there are a number of different ways that we can manage these sites. If they're smaller sites, hand weeding, maybe mowing or weed whacking, string trimming could be beneficial. Spot spraying is sometimes necessary if you have really problematic or potentially noxious weeds. But again, targeting those applications to the specific plant and avoiding any non-target drift or exposure. And then on those larger, maybe acre or more plantings, you can start thinking about potentially utilizing burning, grazing, or haying. And I like those versus mowing because each of them is going to be removing that vegetation from the site. And when it comes to those larger acre or 2 or more in management, the timing is going to be really critical. I'm not going to get into that today because, quite frankly, I don't have enough time. But again, we could spend a whole hour just talking about management alone. But really, the takeaway here is that no matter what size your planting is or where it exists in the world, you're going to be doing some sort of management pretty much always. Hopefully, it gets to a point somewhere down the road where it's fairly minimal and the planting is healthy enough where it's relatively taking care of itself. But generally, for quite some time, you're going to be doing some sort of management. All right, we're getting to case studies, which I think is the best part and the most fun to talk about. I included this example just because I think it's a really good showcase. It's a public showcase. It is owned by a corporation, but it was purposely planted to encourage anyone to enjoy it. There are paths, there are benches, there are educational signs talking about the habitat. This is in downtown Des Moines, just north of the sculpture garden. It's an entire square block. And I think at least 3 out of the 4 blocks are planted with native vegetation and trees. So it's an excellent example. It was planted in 2019. It was planted with plugs, and really the owners just wanted to showcase native plantings and do their part to help the environment, essentially. So I just think it's a really great example if anyone's kind of curious on what something like this could look like, or thinking about design, or thinking about species, etc. Okay, so this is that same example that was conventional site prep slide, but looking the other direction. The landowner was getting cost share and was pretty antsy about her project, and she wanted to plant spring of 2020, or something that she was interested in, but she was willing to do a bit of a hybrid and try something different. So there are times when doing conventional site prep that there could be anywhere from 2 herbicide applications to 4 herbicide applications, depending on who people are working with, goals, budget, weed pressure, etc. I personally try to have as little herbicide application as possible if we can. So I try to stick to 2 or less. In this case, we went ahead and did a glyphosate, I believe, in either very late August or very early September of 2019. And about a week or 2 later, she drilled winter wheat. Rain was very timely, so Mother Nature really worked out in terms of this project. Come November, this picture doesn't justify it very well, but there's at least 3 or 4 inches of growth going into the winter season, which I love to see. This looked better than some of the other cover crops that were planted on larger fields that year. Winter wheat is great because there's no allelopathy going on where there is concern about that when it comes to rye. And it also goes dormant in the winter and green back up in the spring. So the spring, she let it green back up. It's basically serving as a weed suppressant as well as keeping the soil intact. So that soil otherwise would have been pretty bare throughout the winter, but thankfully we didn't have to deal with that. So about mid-April, she went ahead and terminated the winter wheat. So she did another application of herbicide and then drilled her prairie. There were 35 species in her seed mix. She mowed 3 times in the summer of 2020, which is very typical. In June of 2021, I had her mow 1 more time just as some extra assurance. And then we let the planting go throughout the rest of the growing season. And this is what it looked like just the beginning of September of this past year. And after just 2 growing seasons, but really after its kind of first full growing season where it's able to actually flower and produce seed, we saw 19 out of 35 of those species. So that was really encouraging for me. And I consider this a very successful planting. And I'm anxious to see how it matures and does going into the future. This is an example of a backyard setting. A former coworker / friend of mine bought a house and really wanted to plant their own, basically pollinator planting. So they chose the sunniest spots in their yard, which happened to be just the middle section. And then he also went around his shed and the very back fence. That's kind of hard to see in these pictures. He wanted to do everything organically, but quickly found out that was going to be really challenging because the yard had been pretty neglected and the weed pressure was expansive. So he sprayed everything, I believe, in late July, going into August, or I think July maybe, and then actually planted tillage radish and rapeseed. And I thought going into that, like, oh, great, it looks like a dense canopy. It's a great smother crop. And he's like, no, I didn't do it for weed suppression. I did it for soil health. He was not happy with his soils. He thought they were very sterile and just garbage, I think is a direct quote. So he was wanting those soil health benefits, but I think he was also getting likely some weed suppression as well. He let those crops bolt and flower, which is great for pollinators and beneficial insects. He mowed that off in mid to late November. He left all the vegetation just lay. He didn't do anything with it. He said that in the next spring that that vegetation had pretty well just completely decomposed on its own. He didn't have much residual to have to deal with. He has his own compost or creates his own compost. So he was pretty tedious and really gave this planting a lot of TLC, but this was basically the beginning of the pandemic where we all had lots of time. So I think the fencing is a little much, but to each their own. He used plugs and seeds starting off. So he top dressed some of that planting area with compost. And the seeds were just simply a seed packet, I think, that he had gotten somewhere down the road, and he purchased plugs from a nursery. And so he started off with really low diversity, just in general, only a few flowering species. But over time, he has started growing his own plugs, and he's been adding diversity back in. He's been hand harvesting from local roadside remnants and railroad right-of-ways that are in his county and growing out his own plugs and putting them back. And he's not managing weeds or any other pest pressures with chemicals moving forward. He's doing everything organic and holistically. So he has a mixture of these kind of cultivar native species as well as native species. But again, it's working and it looks a lot better than before. And it's providing a much better space for pollinators and other insects. And, Laura Jackson mentioned this in her keynote as well. But, like she said, and I am saying it is 100% true. If you build it, they will come. They will find it. They will utilize it, big or small. It is providing some sort of service. So I love getting pictures from him. I love helping him identify all the different bumblebee species he has in his yard. One of the at-risk in the state is a frequent visitor. So he was really excited to find that species and feel like he's really, really making a difference and pays very close attention to his monarch caterpillar population. So wrapping this all up and thinking about takeaways for today, key things to keep in mind are planting natives and avoiding cultivars when possible. Cultivars are likely not going to be providing the resources, the adequate pollen and nectar that pollinators need. They are bred to be really showy. They're not bred to be producing a lot of pollen and nectar. Providing that overwintering and nesting habitat, reducing or eliminating pesticides, and posting signage and engaging with your community. These efforts, conservation efforts, and a lot of other, passionate efforts that people take throughout their daily lives start at the grassroots level. And it starts with having conversations. It starts with talking with your neighbors. So just let people know what you're doing, why you're doing it, spread the love, spread the knowledge. It can really help make a difference. connect with conservation groups. There are many groups throughout the state that have a wealth of knowledge in terms of native plants. Multiple states have native plant societies. Multiple states have wild ones chapters. We only have one in Iowa, the Les Hills chapter. Iowa Prairie Network is a wonderful organization. The Missouri Prairie Foundation is basically Missouri's version of Iowa Prairie Network. Master Gardeners is getting more interested in native plants, more interested in pollinator work. So just get in touch with these people that are also very interested in conservation, in Iowa's history, and providing more wildlife habitat. Lastly, Xerxes, as always, we have a plethora of resources on our website. We have 2 new handouts, a habitat assessment guide for yards, gardens, and parks that came out within the last year. And then very recently, we have pollinator-friendly parks. So both of these publications go over basically everything I talked about today. The habitat assessment guide will essentially help you kind of grade your pollinator plot and tell you, if you got an A or if there's areas of improvement. And pollinator friendly parks just basically walks you through everything and helps you figure out how to convert public green spaces and other areas into pollinator friendly spaces. And with that, I would like to acknowledge all of our big time donors of Xerxes and of course our members. Our members make up 1/3 of our revenue. So those individual memberships do allow us to continue doing the great work that we do, and it takes a village. And with that, I will take some questions.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah. We do have some time for questions, so if anyone, a round of applause. If anyone has any questions, I'll relay them to Sarah so she can hear. No questions? Yeah, back there.
Who could we contact to come out to our acreage and get some free or inexpensive advice on what to plant in our area? Like what types of plants? Is there anyone at NRCS that could, our local NRCS?
Yeah. So Sarah, the question is, who can people contact to come out to their properties, acreages, houses, and offer some advice? And would NRCS be a place to start, or is there maybe another place that would be better?
Well, NRCS certainly is a good place to start. I have done that for a number of people that have acreages, or, I went to a gal in Waukee who was interested in pollinator habitat. But if you're going through NRCS or me, that technical assistance is going to be free. There's no charge. If you're working with DNR, that technical assistance will always be free. Pheasants Forever, free. So that is what we do. We consult. We help answer questions. That's what we're here for. You could potentially also reach out to a local Master Gardeners group or Iowa State Extension as well.
So I will say NRCS is a great resource, but their primary focus too is working lands. And so if it's an acreage or a property that's not in production, Sarah, was it fair to say that they might be less interested?
I would say that depends on where you're located. Like Polk County, for example, does a lot more with urban stuff than others. But yeah, their bread and butter is definitely working lands, but you can still reach out to them and they can either go out with you or pinpoint you to someone like me or Pheasants Forever to do that. Most of the time I get a lot of those inquiries.
Well, you can have Sarah come out. Any other questions? I saw some other hands. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have any tips or advice on how to plant very sloped
Yeah, so Sarah, the question's about, I think, both site prep and planting of really steep slopes or hillsides and how we can do that without, losing a bunch of soil in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are planting methods like drilling versus broadcast seeding, using companion crops that will grow and green up sooner to help with erosion. The timing of the planting, there are things that we can help mitigate with that. Designing the seed mix so there's more of a grass component helps with that as well.
And that's maybe where some of those technical assistance helpers like yourself could help design some solutions for that particular site, perhaps.
Absolutely, we run into that a lot.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have any thoughts about a pollinator lawn? I've been trying to introduce bird's foot trefoil and Dutch clover through frost seeding and haven't quite succeeded, but I'd like something that flowers but can be maintained with a lower sedatize setting.
I don't know if you heard that, Sarah. The question's about pollinator lawns and maybe interseeding some things into your lawn, but selecting those species so that they can still be, managed with a regular mower, kind of on its highest setting.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk with pollinator lawns, and Minnesota has got some initiatives for folks to incorporate pollinator lawns, and whether that is like allowing your dandelions to bloom and do their thing, which I know freaks a lot of people out and freaks a lot of neighbors out, or potentially interseeding clovers, white clover, red clover might be, I don't know, if it gets kind of bushy, that might turn people off. That is going to provide some pollination, pollinator services. That's not going to support a diversity of pollinators, but it certainly will be helping a lot of butterflies, bumblebees, anything with long tongues can take advantage of clover species. I really don't like bird's foot trefoil personally. I have a lot of bad experiences, so I'm not even going to recommend that for that scenario, but there are other people that probably don't have issue with that particular species.
A few minutes left. Other questions? What's wrong with bird's foot trefoil?
It's very invasive. I know that it's great for forage and it has its place in spots. But as someone who has come from like restoration ecology, I have pulled a lot of bird's foot trefoil out. So it escapes into other places and becomes a headache. So if you're strategic about it and it doesn't it serves its purpose and doesn't go elsewhere, I don't really mind it. But no, from an ecology standpoint, it's not my favorite.
So I just have a comment and kind of a question, but I think backyard spaces, we tend to focus on flowering plants. And you had a slide about grasses. So maybe you want to talk about the importance of also including some of those grass species for a lot of those insects in their life cycles, not just flowering plants. Right.
So a lot of people get really hung up on flowers, and they think if I have just 100% flowers, it is pollinator habitat and it's good to go. And that's just absolutely not the truth. We need to have grasses and sedges included in those plantings. They are providing nesting habitat for things like ground beetles, if they're bunch grasses that are beneficial insects, and also can feed on pollen and or nectar, depending on the species. They're host plants for a number of different butterflies and moths, and they're overwintering habitat as well. And they provide that structure, they provide heterogeneity, like basically having a variety of different structure and heights. Many species benefit from that. And it provides habitat for a lot of other wildlife too, outside the scope of insects and pollinators. So it is 100% beneficial. And if you're thinking of doing even a 1/4 acre of a planting or more, if you're going to be using burning or haying or any of those other management tools. But burning especially, it creates that duff and it allows you to have that thatchy layer to then burn and conduct that management.
Great. We have time maybe for one more question. Christine.
Yeah, so we have maybe a 4-foot by 20-foot bed area behind our garage, and we are big on the pollinator stuff. We haven't done a ton of research, I've learned in this session. And we planted it with wildflowers. We can't burn it because it is right next to our garage, so I'm always wondering when is the best time to mow it or trim it, and I'm always nervous about when do I do it, am I doing it at the right time? So maybe talk more about how to handle your habitat if you can't burn it.
Yeah, so Sarah, the question is about a lot of these smaller patches where burning just isn't feasible or they're right up against buildings. So how do we manage those with mowing? And any principles, I guess, you can share about how best to use mowing or other tactics to manage some of those plantings?
Yeah, so for some of the smaller ones, if hand weeding makes sense at all and it's daunting, of course, that's, I say it's easy, but it's not necessarily easy, but it's
Well, I think,
manageable.
too, to be
in
able
some
to hand
cases,
weed,
But
to be able to hand
Yeah.
weed, you have to be able to identify stuff, right? So maybe that's the first step.
yes,
Yeah.
that's true. Like, what do you have? What's good? What's bad? It's usually a lot easier to identify weeds than it is to sometimes identify these native plants, and certainly depending on what stage of growth they're at. But we can mimic fire with mowing. It's always a little tricky to make blanket management statements because I don't know exactly what plants you have. But typically, if you wanted to mimic fire and you had like grasses that you didn't want or any kind of cool season vegetation that you didn't want, you could mow later in the spring. But I would like rake off that vegetation afterwards or remove the vegetation if you can, just because if it is weedy and you leave weedy vegetation on there, it's just going to kind of facilitate that the soil. It's going to basically encourage the weed growth to still continue. So I like removing that vegetation and composting it or doing something else. But you can mimic the timing of fire with mowing. But it is important to know what plants you have out there. And I didn't get into timing with management because, like I said, you could talk a long time about that. And it's really a case by case scenario. But there are other strategies or a weed whacker if you know, to facilitate mowing too for some cases.
Mm-hmm. Christine, we can hook you up with Sarah. That is all the time we have. So this is the end of our very last session of the PFI conference. Let's give another round of applause for Sarah. Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks for joining us virtually. We appreciate it. Thanks everyone for coming. Please don't forget to turn in your evaluation forms at the first floor info desk. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you guys.